The bridge of the battleship Valiant fell silent as the transmission ended, and Commander Jake Morrison stood frozen with his hands gripping the edge of the tactical display so hard his knuckles turned white. The final screams from Terra Nova still echoed in his mind, and he could hear every one of those 23 million voices that had been cut short in the span of just 17 minutes. He closed his eyes for a moment and tried to push away the images that kept flooding his brain, but they would not leave him alone. Lieutenant Amy Palmer sat at her console with tears running down her face, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the controls. She had family on Terra Nova, and now they were gone along with everyone else who had lived on that beautiful world. She kept hoping that maybe the sensors were wrong and maybe there was some mistake, but deep down she knew the truth. Jake took a deep breath and forced himself to speak in a steady voice even though everything inside him wanted to scream. He needed to be strong for his crew right now, because they were all looking to him for guidance in this terrible moment. He turned to Amy and said to confirm the readings because he had to be absolutely certain before he sent word back to Earth Command. Amy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and checked her instruments 3 times before she answered. She confirmed that the Zinthari bombardment had converted the entire surface of Terra Nova into molten slag, and that there was total atmospheric collapse with no survivors detected anywhere on the planet. Her voice cracked when she said the words, and Jake saw several other crew members bow their heads in grief. Terra Nova had been humanity's crown jewel among all the colony worlds they had built in their 200 years of space exploration. It was a terraformed paradise located 200 light-years from Earth, and it had taken almost a century to make the atmosphere breathable and the soil fertile. Families had lived there in peace, and children had played in parks under 3 moons that hung in the sky like silver ornaments. The cities had been beautiful with gardens on every corner and schools that were the best in human space. Now all of that was gone, and in its place was nothing but a glowing ember of superheated rock that would take thousands of years to cool down. Jake turned to his communications officer and told Lieutenant Greg Hughes to send a priority alpha message to Earth Command immediately. He wanted them to know that the peace talks were completely over and that Terra Nova had been destroyed by the Zinthari. His voice was cold now and filled with a rage that he had been keeping bottled up inside for far too long. Greg looked up at his commander and asked if he should include a recommendation with the message. Everyone on the bridge knew what that meant, because they had all been thinking the same thing for months now. Humanity had been playing nice with the Zinthari Collective for 3 long years, and it had gotten them nothing but death and destruction. The diplomatic approach had failed completely, and it was time to try something else. Jake looked out at the stars through the main view screen, and he could see the distant glow where Terra Nova had once orbited its sun like a jewel in the darkness. For 3 years, humanity had played the role of the peaceful newcomers who were willing to compromise on everything just to avoid war. They had surrendered territory and retreated from confrontations, and bent over backwards to show the galactic community that they were civilized and reasonable. Earth's leaders had truly believed that showing restraint and patience would prove humanity's worth to all the older species who had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. But the Zinthari had interpreted all of that restraint as weakness and nothing more. They saw humanity as prey animals that would run away if you scared them enough. They thought humans were soft and easy to conquer because they always backed down from a fight. Every time humanity had tried to negotiate or find a peaceful solution, the Zinthari had taken it as permission to push harder and demand more. They had been testing humanity's limits for 3 years, and they had finally crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Jake told Greg to include a recommendation in the message, and his voice was quiet but filled with steel. He said to tell Earth Command that it was time to stop pretending to be gentle, because the gentle approach had failed and all it had brought them was graves. The time for talking was over, and the time for action had come at last. Across human space on 47 colony worlds and 15 military stations, the same message was being received at that exact moment. Commanders and captains and admirals were all reading the reports about Terra Nova, and they were all coming to the same conclusion. The same rage was building in the hearts of millions of humans who had lost friends and family to the Zinthari aggression. Parents who had lost children and children who had lost parents, and soldiers who had lost their comrades were all feeling the same burning need for justice. Humanity had been holding back for 3 years and fighting with one hand tied behind its back because they were terrified of revealing what they truly were. They had kept their most powerful weapons locked away, and their most brutal tactics forbidden because they wanted to fit in with galactic society. They had hidden their true nature and pretended to be something they were not. Earth had a long and bloody history filled with wars and conflicts that had raged for thousands of years before humans ever reached the stars. They knew how to fight and they knew how to win, but they had chosen not to show that side of themselves. That was about to change, in a very big way. Jake stood on the bridge of the Valiant and watched as his crew worked to process the disaster that had just occurred. He saw the grief on their faces and the anger in their eyes, and he knew that every single person on his ship was ready to do whatever it took to make the Zinthari pay for what they had done. The rules were about to change, and the Zinthari were about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you push humans too far. The gentle approach had failed, and now it was time to show the galaxy what humanity was really capable of when they stopped holding back and let loose everything they had been keeping locked away. The Zinthari wanted a war, and now they were going to get one, but it would not be the kind of war they were expecting. 3 days after Terra Nova's destruction, Admiral Lisa Grant stood before the assembled War Council in the fortified bunker beneath Geneva, and the room was filled with representatives from every human world and every military branch and every government that still existed in the wake of the Zinthari advance. The air was thick with tension and grief, and a cold fury that had been building for 3 long years of watching their people die while they tried to play by rules that their enemies ignored. Lisa looked at each face in the room, and she saw the same expression on all of them. These were leaders who had run out of patience and diplomacy and hope for a peaceful solution. They had come here knowing what she was going to propose, and they were ready to hear it, even though it would change everything about humanity's place in the galaxy forever. She began by stating the facts in a cold and measured voice that showed no emotion, even though inside she was burning with rage. She told them they had lost 12 colonies in 18 months and 4 billion people were dead or displaced because of the Zinthari advance. The enemy continued to push toward Earth itself, and all of humanity's attempts at diplomacy had achieved nothing except convince the Zinthari that humans were easy prey. Defense Minister Carl Brooks leaned forward in his chair, and his face showed the strain of 3 years spent trying to find a political solution to a military problem. He reminded the Admiral that the Galactic Council had threatened sanctions if humanity escalated beyond defensive measures, and that powerful species like the Vaxil Federation and the Karathi Union had made it very clear that aggressive action would isolate humanity from the rest of galactic civilization. Lisa's eyes narrowed, and she looked at the defense minister with barely concealed contempt. She told him with all due respect that the Galactic Council had done absolutely nothing while humanity was being systematically exterminated from world after world. She pointed out that they had held 17 sessions to discuss the human situation, and 17 sessions was all they had managed while entire worlds burned and billions of people died screaming. The council talked and debated and formed committees, but they never actually did anything to help. She activated the holographic display in the center of the room, and it showed the current theater of war in 3 dimensions, with red indicating Zinthari, controlled space, and blue showing human territory. The amount of red was staggering, and it had grown larger every month for the past year and a half. The Zinthari Collective controlled a vast swath of space, and their empire had been built on the conquest of 73 different species over the course of 4,000 years. Humanity was simply the latest in a long line of victims that the Zinthari had decided to wipe out. Lisa told the council that she was not asking for their permission because the time for asking permission was long past. She was informing them of what was about to happen, whether they liked it or not. For 3 years, humanity had fought according to galactic convention, and they had limited their weapons and restricted their tactics and tried very hard to be the civilized newcomers that everyone expected them to be. All of that was ending today, and it was ending permanently. Colonel Danny Pierce, who was the head of Special Operations, asked if she meant to authorize the Nightfall Protocols, and everyone in the room went very still. The Nightfall Protocols were a series of military doctrines and weapon systems that had been locked away since humanity first made contact with alien species. They represented everything that made human warfare so brutal and effective and terrifying. They were the tactics that had been refined over thousands of years of humans fighting other humans in every possible environment and situation. Lisa confirmed that she meant all of the Nightfall protocols without exception. She said they were going to show the Xinthari and the rest of the galaxy why Earth's history books were filled with warnings about human warfare, and why humanity had such a dark and bloody past. The aliens thought they knew what humans were capable of, but they were completely wrong because humanity had been holding back the entire time. She pulled up another display that showed Earth's military-industrial complex in stunning detail. There were factories that had been running at only 30% capacity for 3 years because humanity had been trying to look peaceful and non-threatening. There were weapon systems that had been kept in storage and never deployed because they were considered too aggressive for galactic sensibilities. There were tactical doctrines that had been locked behind classified protocols because they were too brutal and effective and would have scared the other species. Lisa told them the gloves were coming off right now. She wanted every mothballed warship pulled out of storage and put back into service. She wanted every experimental weapon system activated and tested and deployed as quickly as possible. She wanted every special forces unit that had been kept in reserve to be sent into action immediately. The Xinthari had wanted a war with humanity, and now they were going to get exactly what they asked for, but it would be a war they would never forget. Captain Megan Torres, who commanded the carrier strike group, resolute raised her hand and asked the question that everyone was thinking. She said that once humanity unleashed the full scope of human warfare, there would be no going back, and the other species in the galaxy would see what humans truly were beneath the civilized surface they had been showing. The mask would come off and it could never be put back on again. Lisa's expression did not change at all when she answered. She said to let the other species see the truth and let them understand why humanity had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars. She wanted them to learn why humans had climbed to the top of Earth's food chain and stayed there despite every challenge that nature and other humans had thrown at them. Humanity had tried peace, and they had tried diplomacy, and they had tried being gentle and accommodating, and it had gotten 4 billion people killed. She closed the display with a sharp gesture and looked around the room at all the assembled leaders. She told them that now it was time to remind the universe what happened when you made humans truly angry. She said that humanity had spent 3 years being the victim and playing the role of the peaceful species that just wanted to get along with everyone. That role had failed completely, and now it was time to show the galaxy who humans really were when they stopped pretending. The vote was unanimous, and the orders went out within the hour. Across human space, the military began to mobilize on a scale that had not been seen since the great wars of Earth's past. Shipyards that had been quiet roared to life, and factories began running around the clock. Soldiers who had been training in secret were finally given permission to use everything they had learned. Weapons that had been considered too dangerous were taken out of storage and loaded onto ships. The galaxy was about to learn a very important lesson about humanity, and it was going to be taught in fire and blood. The Xinthari 4th Fleet advanced on the mining colony of New Aberdeen with confidence that came from years of easy victories over the humans. Fleet Commander Zaxthar sat in his command throne and watched the tactical displays with barely concealed boredom, because he had overseen the destruction of 6 human worlds already, and the pattern was always exactly the same. The humans would retreat and call for negotiations, and ultimately surrender the system when they realized they were facing superior firepower, and there was no hope of winning. His scanner technician reported that they were detecting human vessels ahead, and the configuration matched the defensive patterns that the Xinthari had seen dozens of times before. There were 12 warships arranged in a standard formation, with what appeared to be their usual loadout of weapons and defensive systems. Nothing about the situation seemed different from any of the previous encounters, and Zaxthar settled more comfortably into his seat. He told his crew to proceed as planned and ordered them to destroy the military assets first and then begin the orbital bombardment of the colony below. It would take a few hours to complete the operation, but by the end of the day, New Aberdeen would be another smoking ruin, and the humans would have learned once again that resistance was pointless. The Xinthari had been conquering species for 4,000 years, and they knew how to break the will of their enemies. But as the Xinthari fleet closed to weapons range, something changed in a way that Zaxthar had never experienced before in his long military career. The human ships did not retreat like they always had in the past. They did not open communication channels to beg for negotiations or ask for terms of surrender. Instead, they activated systems that the Xinthari had never seen before and had no idea even existed. Captain Ryan Cooper stood on the bridge of the destroyer Havoc and smiled grimly as his weapons officer announced they had target lock on every enemy ship in the formation. He opened a fleet-wide channel and told all ships that this was Havoc Actual, and they were to execute Nightfall Alpha immediately. He said it was time to introduce the Xinthari to humanity's real arsenal and show them what humans had been holding back for 3 years. The space between the two fleets erupted with violence that was so sudden and so intense that it stunned the Xinthari commanders into momentary paralysis. Instead of the careful and measured responses they had come to expect from human forces, the humans unleashed absolute hell with every weapon system they had been keeping secret. The change was so dramatic that it took several seconds for the Xinthari to even understand what was happening to them. Kinetic kill vehicles that had been accelerated to 70% of light speed tore through Xinthari shields like they were made of tissue paper. The alien defensive screens had been designed over centuries to stop energy weapons and conventional missiles, and they were very effective against those traditional threats. But they had absolutely no answer for telephone. Pole-sized tungsten rods that were moving at relativistic speeds and carrying kinetic energy that was almost incomprehensible. Zax, Thor shouted for evasive maneuvers, but his ship's computer was already screaming warnings in a language that sounded panicked even though it was just a machine. The humans had deployed something their database identified as a Kessler swarm, which consisted of millions of tiny explosive charges that created an expanding cloud of shrapnel in space. 3 Xinthari cruisers flew directly into the trap before they could change course, and their hulls were shredded by thousands of cascading collisions that happened faster than their crews could react. Then the real surprise came, and it was worse than anything the Xinthari had imagined possible. Commander Beth Hayes sat aboard the stealth ship Phantom and watched with satisfaction as her infiltration virus took hold of the enemy fleet's computer systems. For 6 months, human intelligence operatives had been carefully mapping Xinthari computer networks and looking for vulnerabilities in their security protocols. They had found plenty of weaknesses because the Xinthari had never fought an enemy that understood digital warfare the way humans did. Beth reported that the virus was fully deployed and working exactly as designed. She told the fleet that Xinthari targeting systems were now identifying their own ships as hostile targets, and their fire control computers were completely confused about who was friend and who was enemy. The virus was elegant and brutal, and it spread through the enemy network like wildfire. Chaos erupted in the Xinthari formation as ships began firing on each other because their computers told them they were shooting at human vessels. Crews desperately tried to regain control of their systems, but the virus had buried itself deep in their operating code, and it would take hours to root out if they even survived that long. Meanwhile, the human warships pressed their attack with coordinated precision that spoke of centuries of military evolution and countless wars fought against equally sophisticated opponents. This was the warfare of a species that had fought itself for thousands of years before ever reaching the stars. This was tactical doctrine that had been refined in 1,000 conflicts, ranging from ancient naval battles on Earth's oceans to modern mechanized warfare on land and in air and in space. Humans had been killing other humans with increasing efficiency for their entire history, and they had learned lessons that species like the Xinthari could not even imagine. The Xinthari 4th Fleet lasted exactly 19 minutes from the moment the humans opened fire to the moment the last enemy ship exploded in a ball of superheated plasma. 19 minutes to destroy a fleet that had conquered 6 human worlds and killed billions of people. 19 minutes to show the Xinthari that everything they thought they knew about human capabilities was completely and utterly wrong. As the last enemy ship broke apart, Ryan Cooper opened a channel to New Aberdeen Colony and told them they were secure. He ordered his communications officer to send a message back to Earth, command stating that Phase 1 was successful and that the enemy now knew without any doubt that humanity had been holding back their true strength. The pretense was over, and the Xinthari were about to learn what it meant to fight humans who were no longer playing by Galactic rules. Across the bridge of the Havoc, his crew worked with quiet efficiency as they prepared for the next engagement. There was no celebration or cheering or victory speeches, because they all understood they had a job to do and Terra Nova's ashes demanded justice. This was just the first step in a long campaign, and there would be many more battles before the war was over. The pretense of gentleness was finished, and humanity had finally shown its teeth. The Zinthari had spent 3 years thinking humans were weak and soft and easy to defeat. Now they knew the truth, but the knowledge had come far too late to save them from what was coming next. Word of the Zinthari defeat spread through the galaxy faster than light travel, and species that had watched humanity's defensive war with detached interest suddenly began reviewing their intelligence reports about humans with growing concern. Military analysts from a dozen different civilizations pored over the sensor data from New Aberdeen, and what they saw made even the most experienced warriors feel a cold chill run down their spines, or whatever appendages they used for spines. Ambassador Helen Foster stood before the Galactic Council in the Great Chamber on the neutral world of Vaxia, and her face was calm, but her words cut like knives through the assembled representatives. She told them that for 18 months humanity had appealed to this body for assistance, and for 18 months the Council had debated endlessly while human worlds burned. She reminded them that they had told humanity to show restraint and to follow galactic convention, and to prove themselves civilized by the standards of older species. The Vaxil representative, who was a crystalline being named Thexal, shifted uncomfortably in its containment field, and the light refracted through its body in patterns that indicated distress. It said that the Zinthari were a powerful empire with thousands of years of military history, and that direct confrontation with them risked expanding the conflict into something that could destabilize entire sectors of the galaxy. Helen's response was cold and direct. She told Thexal that the conflict had already expanded, far beyond what anyone had anticipated, and the Zinthari had made absolutely sure of that when they murdered 23 million civilians on Terra Nova without any provocation or warning. She said she was not here to ask for the Council's help anymore, because that ship had sailed long ago. She was here only to inform them that humanity would prosecute this war using every means at their disposal without limitation or restriction. Thexal's form flickered with alarm, in a way that showed it understood exactly what Helen was implying. It said that humanity could not possibly mean to violate the conventions of warfare that had been established over thousands of years. The restrictions on kinetic weapons and on artificial intelligence and on biological agents existed for very good reasons, and those reasons had been written in the blood of species that had learned hard lessons about unlimited warfare. Helen's smile was sharp and held no warmth at all. She told the Council that those conventions existed because peaceful species could afford to show mercy to their enemies and fight with restraint. She said humanity had tried that approach for 3 years, and it had gotten 4 billion of her people killed. So she wanted to be absolutely clear about what was going to happen next. Humanity would no longer fight with one hand tied behind its back, and they would no longer limit themselves to weapons and tactics that made the other species comfortable. She activated a holographic display in the center of the Council chamber, and it showed the complete destruction of the Zinthari Fourth Fleet in horrifying detail. The Council chamber fell completely silent as they watched human warships employ tactics that made even veteran military leaders from warrior species flinch and look away. The efficiency was frightening, and the brutality was calculated, and the speed of the victory was something that should not have been possible against a fleet that size. Helen told them that what they were seeing was just the beginning of what humanity was capable of when they stopped pretending to be something they were not. She said that every weapon system humans had developed and then voluntarily restricted was now back in play. Every tactical doctrine they had deemed too brutal for galactic sensibilities would now be used without hesitation. Every aspect of warfare that had made humanity dominant on their own world was being unleashed on the Zinthari, and nothing would be held back anymore. The Karathi ambassador, who was a large reptilian being named Eskath, spoke up with a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. It asked if humanity was willing to risk galactic isolation and economic sanctions and possible military intervention from peacekeeping forces. The threat was clear, even though the words were diplomatic. The galaxy would not tolerate a species that fought without restraint. Helen turned to face the Karathi directly, and her eyes were hard as steel. She told Skath that her people had a saying from their history. The saying was to speak softly and carry a big stick. She explained that for 3 years humanity had spoken softly, and tried diplomacy and tried compromise, and the Zinthari had interpreted all of that as weakness. They had killed billions of humans because they thought humans would not fight back with real force. Now the galaxy was going to see the stick that humanity had been carrying all along. She pulled up another display, and this one showed Earth's industrial output in numbers that made several council members gasp with shock. Shipyards were operating at full capacity and building warships at a rate that seemed impossible. Factories were churning out weapons and ammunition by the millions every single day. The entire human economy had been mobilized for total war in a way that most galactic species had not seen in thousands of years. Helen said quietly that humanity had come to the stars hoping for peace above all else. They had wanted to be partners with other civilizations and to learn from them and to grow alongside them in friendship. But if the price of galactic acceptance was allowing genocide against human worlds, then humanity would make its own path forward without the Council's blessing or permission. She closed the displays and looked around the chamber at all the assembled representatives from dozens of different species. She told them that the war would continue until the Zinthari collective surrendered unconditionally or ceased to exist as a political entity. Any species that gave aid to the Zinthari would be considered hostile to humanity. Any species that interfered with human military operations would be treated as an enemy combatant. Humanity was done asking permission from the Council to defend itself. As Helen left the chamber, the Council erupted into heated debate with representatives shouting at each other in a dozen different languages. Some demanded immediate sanctions against humanity, while others argued that the humans were only doing what any species would do when faced with extermination. A few of the more militarily experienced species sat quietly and reviewed the battle. Data from New Aberdeen with growing unease because they understood what it meant, but the message had been delivered clearly and without any room for misunderstanding. Humanity was no longer the desperate newcomer seeking acceptance from the established powers of the galaxy. They were not going to play by rules that got their people killed while everyone else watched and did nothing. They had revealed themselves as something the galaxy had not seen in a very long time. They were an apex predator that had been pretending to be prey, and now the mask had come off permanently. The galaxy was beginning to realize what that meant, and the implications were terrifying for species that had grown comfortable in their ancient power. 6 months after the destruction of Terra Nova, the human fleet arrived at Zinthara Prime, and the sight of the Zinthari homeworld filled every view screen on every ship in the massive Armada. It was not the largest human force ever assembled, but it was the most focused and the most determined because every person in the fleet had lost someone they loved to the Zinthari aggression. They had come here for one purpose, and that purpose burned in their hearts like a fire that could never be extinguished. Admiral Lisa Grant stood on the bridge of the dreadnought, Retribution, and watched the enemy world grow, larger as they approached. Intelligence reports estimated that 40 billion Zinthari lived on the planet below, and they were protected by orbital defenses that had never been breached in 4,000 years of warfare. The Zinthari had built their homeworld into a fortress that they believed was completely impregnable, and for millennia they had been proven right. Commander Paul Jensen, who was her tactical officer, reported that all fleet elements were in position and ready to commence the attack. He told her they had firing solutions on every military target in the entire system, and that they could begin the bombardment whenever she gave the order. His voice was steady, but she could hear the tension underneath, because everyone knew what this moment meant for humanity's future. Lisa nodded slowly and stood in silence for a long moment as she thought about what they were about to do. They could follow through with the bombardment and could repay the Zinthari in kind for Terra Nova and all the other colonies that had been destroyed. It would be justice by the standards of galactic warfare, and no one could say that humanity did not have the right to take revenge. The Zinthari had started this war and they had killed billions of humans without mercy. Or they could prove that humanity was different from the Zinthari in ways that mattered more than military strength. They could show the galaxy that humans understood the difference between justice and vengeance. They could demonstrate that the most dangerous species was not the one that fought without restraint, but the one that could choose restraint even when they had the power to destroy. Lisa ordered her communications officer to open a channel to the Zinthari High Command, and the holographic display flickered to life, showing the collective's supreme leader. He was an elderly Zinthari named Krathax, and his expression was defiant despite the overwhelming human fleet that surrounded his world. He clearly expected to die today, but he was determined to face death with pride intact. Krathax spoke first, and his voice was harsh with contempt. He said that humans had come to take revenge and to show that humanity was just as brutal as any species in the galaxy. He told Lisa to go ahead and prove that all the human talk of civilization and restraint had been lies from the beginning. He wanted her to know that even in death the Zinthari would not beg for mercy. Lisa stared at the alien leader for a long moment and let the silence stretch out between them. She told him that humanity could destroy his world without any difficulty at all. They had the military capability, and they had the moral justification by every standard of warfare that existed in the galaxy. The Zinthari had murdered billions of human beings, and by any measure they deserved to have their homeworld turned into burning slag just like they had done to Terra Nova. Krathax challenged her to do it. Then and to stop wasting time with words. He said that if she was going to commit genocide, then she should just get it over with and stop pretending that humans were any different from the Zinthari. His words were meant to provoke her into making a mistake and proving his point about humanity. But Lisa's response was quiet and firm. She said no, and the single word seemed to echo in the silence of both bridges. She told Krathax that humanity was going to show him and the entire galaxy the difference between humans and the Zinthari collective. They were going to demonstrate what humans were truly capable of, and it was not what anyone expected. She turned to Paul and gave orders that made every person on the bridge stop and stare at her in surprise. She told him to target all military installations and orbital defenses and the collective's command structure, with surgical strikes only. She specified 0 civilian casualties, and her voice made it clear that this was not a suggestion, but an absolute requirement. Paul hesitated for just a moment because what she was asking seemed impossible. He told her that the level of precision required had never been attempted on this scale before, and that the margin for error was incredibly small. One mistake could kill millions of civilians and turn this into the very massacre they were trying to avoid. Lisa told him she was fully aware of the difficulty, and she ordered him to execute immediately. She had faith in her people and in the technology that humanity had developed. If anyone could pull off this kind of surgical strike, it was the men and women of the human fleet who had trained their entire lives for moments exactly like this one. What followed over the next 3 hours was a demonstration of military capability that left the entire watching galaxy absolutely stunned into silence. Human warships coordinating through quantum-entangled communication networks struck thousands of targets simultaneously with accuracy that was measured in centimeters rather than meters. Zinthari military assets simply ceased to exist as kinetic strikes and precision missiles destroyed them with perfect accuracy. Defense platforms exploded and command bunkers collapsed and military bases vanished in clouds of debris. But not a single civilian structure was touched, and not one residential area was damaged. The Zinthari military might that had been built over 4,000 years of conquest was completely neutralized in 3 hours without a single civilian casualty. It was a feat that military historians would study for centuries to come, because it should not have been possible. The level of coordination and precision required was beyond what any species had ever demonstrated in the history of galactic warfare. Lisa opened a broadcast on all channels so that every being in the system could hear her words. She identified herself as Admiral Lisa Grant of the Human Defense Fleet, and she told them that the Zinthari Collective's military had been neutralized and their government structure was dismantled. But she made it very clear that humanity had not harmed the civilian population, because that was not who humans were, or who they would ever be. She paused and let her words sink in before continuing. She said that humanity had gone to war not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice when faced with extermination. They had fought with everything they had because their very survival had demanded it. But they would not become monsters just to defeat monsters, and they would not commit genocide even when they had every justification to do so. The war was over, and the collective would be dissolved and Zinthari worlds would be placed under galactic oversight until a peaceful government could be established. Krathax stared at her with an expression that mixed confusion with something that might have been respect. He asked how humans could have had the Zinthari completely at their mercy and chosen not to take everything. He did not understand why humanity would show restraint when they had earned the right to revenge. Lisa's answer was simple and direct. She told him that yes, humanity could have destroyed his species entirely, but then they would be exactly what the Zinthari had thought they were from the beginning. Instead, humanity had chosen to prove that they could be both strong and merciful at the same time. They could wage war with unmatched ferocity when necessary, and they could choose peace when victory was achieved. That was what made humanity different. She closed the channel and turned to her crew and told them to stand down from combat alert. They needed to begin coordinating with Galactic peacekeeping forces because the war was finally over, after 6 months of brutal fighting. Captain Nathan Price, who was her second in command, spoke quietly. He said that the galaxy had just witnessed what happened when humans decided to stop holding back their true capabilities, and now they were going to be afraid of humanity. Fear could be just as dangerous as open hostility. Lisa nodded slowly because she knew he was right. But she also knew that fear combined with respect was better than contempt. The galaxy would remember what happened here today, and they would understand that human restraint was a choice and not a weakness. They would think very carefully before threatening humanity again, because they had seen what humans could do when pushed too far. She looked out at the stars and thought about Terra Nova and about the billions who had died and about all the sacrifice it had taken to reach this moment. Humanity had tried being gentle and diplomatic, and when that failed, they had shown the galaxy their true strength. But in the end, they had proven that humanity's greatest power was not in destruction, but in the wisdom to choose mercy, even when vengeance was justified and in their hands.